Here's Ryan, man. That is a freaking
day.
Nice. In this session, we hope to help some of you better understand Skagit Style Spey Casting. I'm going to do this by first defining Skagit casting and how it differs from traditional style Spey Casting. And in doing so, we'll also define some of the terminology and some of the lingo as Skagit casters use. But let me please also make the disclaimer here, we're not making a full-length DVD on Skagit Style Casting. We're simply creating a platform here for us to build upon. In the future, we plan to provide other videos that include things like troubleshooting and more advanced Skagit techniques. So let's start with defining Skagit Style Casting and how it differs from traditional style Spey Casting. A lot of people falsely make the assumption that just because we're using a two-handed rod or a Spey rod that they're one and the same, and they're not. They're two totally different casts. I can't emphasize it enough. Even though some of the lingo is the same, some of the verbiage is the same, they're two totally different casts. And where they differ is where in the casting stroke our energy is stored and how the load is acquired. So let's break it down. In actuality, traditional style Spey casting has more in common with overhead style casting than it does with Skagit style casting. Reason being, once again, where in the casting stroke the energy is stored. When we think about it, as you go into your backstroke with an overhead cast, the line is propelled behind you, and it's the weight of that line pulling on the rod that bends the rod, stores the energy that we're then going to use to propel our line forward. In traditional style Spey casting is very similar. As we go into our backstroke, we end up propelling this loop of line behind us that pulls on the rod, loads the rod, stores the energy that we're then once again going to use to propel our line forward. And in Spey style casting, this loop of line we refer to as our D loop. And this D loop ends up being a vital part of both of our styles of cast. So let's take a closer look at it. For those of you that don't know, our D loop in Spey style casting is the loop of line that is propelled behind us as we go into our backstroke. And it's the shape of that loop that gives it its name. As you can see, as we go into our backstroke, we end up with a loop of line that is propelled behind us that comes off our rod tip to where our line is anchored in the water here, which we're going to define as our anchor point. And you can visualize as we go into our backstroke, this loop of line ends up creating the shape of the front half of our capital D. The rod ends up creating the shape of the back half of our capital D, thus giving it its name. Let's take a look at it from the side. So once again, as we take a look at it, as I go into my backstroke, I end up creating this loop of line behind me. And it's the shape of this loop of line that ends up creating the front half of my capital D. My rod ends up creating the back half of my capital D. And it's very important that we understand this and we understand the D loop, because the D loop ends up being a vital part of all styles of Spey casting. So coming back to traditional style Spey casting, to fully recognize what's going on, we must understand the equipment that's being used. Once again, with traditional style Spey casting, most of our load is acquired with this D loop that is being propelled behind us. But when you think about it, to fully load the rod, we must create a very large D loop. And that's the distinction that must be made. With traditional style Spey casting, to create a large enough loop to fully load our rod, we're forced to use a much longer bellied line. And here we must also note, to create this large loop and to carry that longer bellied line in the air, we're oftentimes forced to use a much longer rod. So, to summarize and simplify without going through the cast itself, it's important to note that with traditional style Spey casting, we're developing most of our load with a large D loop behind us that is created on a much longer belly line that is cast on a longer rod. Now that we understand it's the D loop that loads the rod in traditional style Spey casting, let's take a look at how we load the rod in Skagit style casting. So once again, the defining element in Skagit style casting is where in our casting stroke and how the rod is loaded. In Skagit style casting, it's the line being ripped off the water that's loading our rod. It's the resistance of this anchored line being ripped or torn off the water that's bending our rod, storing the energy, and creating the load that's going to then propel our line forward. In Skagit style casting, you'll often hear people refer to this rip or tear as the white mouse or the white rat. What you can see is you'll see this little white rooster tail coming off the back of our line as we tear it around. So to emphasize, Skagit style casting, it's the line being ripped or torn off the water that's creating the load, bending our rod, and storing the energy that we're then going to use to propel our line forward. So now that we understand how the load is created in Skagit style casting, let's break down the casting stroke a little bit. And you know, the casting stroke is actually really very easy. It's a very simple cast. And I think to best illustrate this, I can use a story that I often tell when I'm doing presentations and stuff. And it's a story of a client I had years and years ago when the Skagit stuff was just first hitting the scene. And it's a story of this guy that shows up to me. He'd been to a fly shop, and this fly shop had sold him a brand new outfit, a brand new spey rod, and a brand new spey line to go with it. And when this guy shows up, I look at it, and even though it's not what I would have recommended, I let the guy go out and have at it because he was so excited about his new outfit that I let the guy flail around for a while. And before he got too frustrated, I went over to the boat, I grabbed my Skagit style setup, went out to the guy, and with just a few short instructions, and in a short time, the guy was casting enough line to be fishing efficiently, was shooting line just thinking that he was just Mr. Spey Caster. He went home, had a great day, totally sold on the Skagit technique. Went back to the fly shop owner, told him about the day he'd spent with me, how much he loved Skagit casting, how far he was shooting line, how easy he was turning over sink tips, how easy he was turning over these big things, all these great things I'd sold this guy on. And the guy across the counter, kind of with disgust, turned and looked at the guy and said, well, Skagit casting isn't spey casting. He goes, that's so easy, even a chimpanzee could do it. And for some reason, that guy across the counter thought there was something wrong with that, where I, on the other hand, kind of thought, well, shoot, if a chimpanzee can do it, well, then I must obviously be able to do it. And that's exactly what we've done with this stuff. I didn't realize we were trying to create tackle that complicate things and makes it more difficult. I thought we were trying to create tackle that simplify things and make it easier. And that's exactly what we've done with this Skagit stuff. Our heads have gotten shorter, our rods have gotten shorter, our casting strokes are much more compact, and you know what? Just by remembering a few basic steps, this cast ends up being a very, very simple and easy cast to learn. So what is Skagit casting? For starters, it's important to remember that Skagit casting is a continual motion cast. And what I mean by this is, once my line is anchored, my casting stroke is a very fluid motion with no stops, pauses, or hesitations. And for that reason, I like to refer to it as the fluid cast. So once again here, let me emphasize, Skagit casting is a continual motion cast where once my line is anchored, my casting stroke is a very fluid motion with no stops, pauses, or hesitations. So let's take a look at a few. Now I'm going to talk you through one. Going to raise the rod high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. It's exactly what I tell my students when I'm teaching them. Raise high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. Notice there's no stops or hesitations in my casting stroke. Watch once again how fluid this motion is. Raise high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. One more time. Raise high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. Now let's break the cast down into its individual components. The first component of Skagit style casting is getting our line anchored. And proper line placement when anchoring our line is to get our line to land on the water upstream from us like this. Let's look at it once more time. We want to get our line to land on the water upstream from us like this so it can settle, so we can then go into our tear, which is where we know we acquire our load in this cast. But equally important is our fly placement as well. And we want a fly to land about a rod tip length away at a 45-degree angle just downstream from us, right about in here where I'm slapping my tip on the water. Want our fly to land right about in there somewhere. See, right in this area. Once again, I'm going to raise high, line placement in the proper spot, fly placement in the proper spot. And that's where this raise high, stop low comes into play. So as we raise high, we break our line and our fly free from the water so we can easily get our fly and our line placed in the proper spot. It can be very difficult to drag a large fly and a heavy sink tip up through the water and get your line placed in the proper spot. If you just simply drag it up through the water, it's very tough to get that line or fly placed in the proper position. So if we watch, raise high, breaking our line and our fly free from the water, stopping low, setting our line and our fly in the water in the proper position. Now this could probably be the most difficult of all the Skagit components to master. It's just one of those things, it takes time on the water and takes practice. But when you're first starting out, what I want you to focus on primarily is this fly placement, and that's for two reasons. One is just simply safety. If as we raise high, we end up placing our fly upstream from us like this, as we then come around and go into our power stroke forward, that fly is going to come right up and hit our rod, or worse yet, hit us in the side of the face. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing like a 3-inch intruder sticking you in the side of the cheek to remind you of this. So you really want to focus on your fly placement first. And for reason two is, as you watch, if we get our fly placed in the proper spot, our line ends up landing in the right spot as well. Let's look at it one more time. What I'm going to do, I'm going to raise high, breaking my line and fly free from the water, stopping low, focusing on my fly placement. Fly land in the right spot, look at my lines in the right spot as well. One more time. Raise high, stop low, focusing on my fly placement, and my line placement is right where I need to be so I can then go into my tear. And like I say, this is probably the most difficult of all of the Skagit components. It's just something you're probably going to want to spend some time just working on this component all by itself. Because I'll tell you, it's the kind of thing that once you're able to consistently get your line and your fly placed in the proper spot, the rest of the steps will just fall into place. Now let's talk about the tear component of our cast. And as we discussed earlier, we know this is where we acquire our load when Skagit casting. So as we take a look at it, the tear component is where we go from our low line anchor position and draw a nice fluid arc with our rod into the high 10 o'clock position. Now it's really important to understand here, it's at this high 10 o'clock position that we've formed our D-loop and fully loaded our rod. So once again, as we take a look at it, the tear component is simply where we go from a low line anchor position and draw a nice fluid arc with our rod into the high 10 o'clock loaded position. To help us better understand the tear component of our cast, I want to clarify a few things here. First, I want to revisit and emphasize the fact that the only place in my cast that I'm going to stop, pause, or hesitate is as I'm anchoring my line prior to my tear stroke. Two, I also want you to notice that my tear stroke is not this aggressive ripping of the line off the water. I'm not vigorously ripping my line off the water in an attempt to try to load my rod. That's the beauty of today's lines. We now have these short, compact heads that sufficiently load our rod with a nice fluid sweep around. I want you to notice here. Watch the rod bend, watch the rooster tail coming off the back of my line with a nice fluid sweep. Once we understand these things, once again the tear component ends up being very simple. It's as easy as taking our rod from a low line anchor position, drawing a nice fluid arc into our high 10 o'clock loaded position. Let's look at it once again. The tear component is as simple as going from our low line anchor position and drawing a nice fluid arc into our high 10 o'clock loaded position. Now that we've acquired the load with our tear and developed our D as we got into the 10 o'clock load position, we're ready for the turn and go component of our Skagit cast. But before we do, it's really important here that I emphasize a few things. The first thing that's important for you to understand here is that it's really important that you visualize that yes, we have acquired a load with our tear. But what we've done here is that we've acquired a horizontal rod load where our rod is bent back on itself like this. And as you can visualize, as we come around, the only thing we're going to be able to use this energy for and this load to do is to propel our line and our fly into the bushes. So what we have to do is that we have to take this horizontal rod load and transfer that into a vertical rod load where our rod is bent back on itself like this, so we can then use that energy to propel our fly forward. The second thing that's important to emphasize here is the purpose of our D-loop in Skagit style casting. As we discussed earlier, we know in traditional style spey casting we're using this large exaggerated D-loop behind us to do our rod loading. But as we now know, in Skagit style casting we're loading our rod with this tear. And we're simply using our D to maintain tension while we transfer our energy from a horizontal rod load into a vertical rod load. Let me say it one more time. In Skagit style casting, we're simply using our D to maintain tension while we transfer the energy from a horizontal rod load into a vertical rod load. The other thing I want to point out here has simply to do with the equipment that we're using. And that is that our Skagit heads are very short. This head I have right here is only 20 feet long. So as you can visualize, as I come around, I don't end up with this big, large, exaggerated D behind me. As I come around into my 10 o'clock load position, this D-loop is very shallow. Say my head's only 20 feet long. So as I come around into my 10 o'clock load position, my D-loop has instantly formed. Now that I've done my tear, I'm ready to go into the turn and go component of my Skagit cast. And this is where I transfer the energy from a horizontal rod load into a vertical rod load. And this transfer is easy if I just remember one thing. And that is, as I learned in Physics 101, energy just doesn't dissipate into thin air. I can be assured I can transfer that energy from a horizontal rod load into a vertical rod load if I don't lose it somewhere along the way. And this generally only happens if I do one of three things. First is don't dip your rod during your casting stroke. As we tear around and our rod is loaded, as soon as we dip our rod, our line touches the water, the energy is absorbed, and our rod is unloaded. This is the hardest concept for people to grasp. So I don't know if it's just innately part of the human genome, but people just want to throw a dip into their stroke. Or if they've just watched too many videos where anglers come around, dip, touch, and go. But let me emphasize here, this is not Scandi casting, this is not traditional style spey casting, this is Skagit casting where we don't put any dip in our stroke. Second is don't stop or pause as we come into our high 10 o'clock load position. Remember, as we discussed earlier with these short Skagit heads, our D-loops ultimately end up being very shallow. We don't have to sit here and wait for this big, large, exaggerated D-loop to form the same way that traditional style spey casters do. In Skagit casting, as we come into our high 10 o'clock load position, our D-loop is instantly formed. So if we stop or pause here at all, our line begins to sag, and as our line sags, our rod begins to unload, till ultimately our line touches the water and our rod completely unloads. So remember, we're going to go from our tear into a fluid stroke with no stops or pauses into our turn and go component of our cast. The third way you lose the load in your rod is by pulling your fly free from the water during your backstroke, or what we call blowing your anchor. And this is simply done by pulling too hard or applying too much power into your backstroke to the point that your fly breaks free from the water. At that point, you lose the load in your rod. From here, taking everything into consideration, the turn and go component of our cast should be the easiest. And it is, it's very simple. We simply go from a low rod line anchor position, drawing a nice fluid arc into our high rod 10 o'clock load position, to a nice continual motion turn and go. It's really very simple. Let's look at it again. We're going to raise high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. Let's look at it one more time. I'm going to raise high, stop low, tear, turn, and go. That's all there is to it. You should now have a better understanding of Skagit style casting. And hopefully we've created a platform here that we can build on in the future. But please remember here, we were just covering the basics. I understand there's details and nuances to every component of this cast. For example, the first question I'm going to get from people is going to be, as I go into my power stroke forward, do I push hard with my top hand or do I pull hard with my bottom hand? And yes, this is a legitimate question, and it is something we'll discuss in the future. But for starters, if you just stick to the basics we talked about here, you'll be able to Skagit cast. If you simply raise high, stop low, fluid tear, continual motion, turn and go, the rod will cast for you. It's that simple. Let me show you a little demonstration. I'm going to take this rod with one hand, and I'm not going to focus on whether I'm pushing with my top hand or pulling with my bottom hand. I'm simply going to stick to the basics of what we've talked about. I'm going to raise high, stop low, fluid tear, continual motion, turn and go, and I could easily cast a fishable length of line. Like I say, it's that simple. But I do hope you come back and visit us in the future as we take this discussion further.